Okay, welcome everybody. Good to see you all. You'll see some of you might have seen our fancy backdrop from the launch of the Worldview project, I think back in October. Since then, we've all been very busy with actually getting this first lot of survey results, which we will speak to today. Great to have you all there. I suppose just to warm us up, maybe we could just see who's on the call. So in the chat, if you could put maybe your name and what you do. Are you here as a communicator, as a marketer, as a fundraiser, as a programmer? Let us know who's out there, if that's okay. We're also putting into the chat the hashtags. So look, this will be recorded and you'll see it afterwards. But we're also hoping to practice what we preach by getting out there on the social media. So please do use the hashtags and tweet away if you can. I would like to start actually with thank yous rather than leave it till the end. And in particular, thank you to my team, to Vicky, who's the project coordinator of this, for getting us all here, and for Ronan, who is on the tech today. So thanks, guys. We're here so far, so good. Good to have you, and thanks for everything. Also to members of the steering group. I can't tell you how much work they've put into this, not just over the last few months, but over the last few years. We will be hearing from some of them on the panel, but really important to thank them. We'll put the names up in the chat there now. This has been a real kind of membership collective effort. And also just to give a shout out to Paula Kenny from Irish Aid, who's been very active on the steering group, but also a real supporter of this project. So I'd like to thank her and all colleagues at Irish Aid. Just so that you know, you're pretty clear now on Zoom protocol. Please do keep your camera on if you feel you can. It's good to see people rather than just to feel them here in Shakur, but do put on mute if you can. The hashtags are there, Worldview IRL and hashtag Irish Aid Works. There will be a time for Q&A during the sessions, 2 moments for that. If you want to ask a question, please raise your electronic hand and we will see if you can ask in person, which is always a lot better than in the chat. But otherwise, please keep them flowing in the chat. My only request is to keep the questions quite short because it's hard to read them and ask the question and then try and listen to the answer as well. But let's use the chat, the questions, the comments. Let's hear from you guys out there so that we can make this as interactive as we can. As I said, we will be recording this. It will be available later. But let's remember, this is also the launch of our toolkit. So everything you hear today, including the details of the research findings, will be on our website, a specially designed toolkit, which has now gone live. So make sure to have a look at that now and later, and everything will be up on there. So now let us get started. We're going to start by a short opening statement from Minister Brophy. We will then go into the findings and we will hear from Mcshane from Behaviour Attitudes, who actually conducted the surveys. And after that, from Keelan Appleby, who will give her reflections on what this data actually means. After that, we will then go into a panel discussion. After all, research is only as good as how we use it. So our panelists coming from a fundraising perspective, marketing perspective, and lastly, from Matty to give us a diaspora perspective. How are we going to use this research now? Because after all, this project is about building a collective narrative to engage better with the Irish public. So stay with us. We hope to finish up by 1 o'clock, and let's get started. So over to you, Minister Brophy. No need for introductions, I'm sure, at this stage, but you are the Minister of State for Overseas Development and Diaspora. Just important to say that you've been really keen and interested in this project from the very beginning when you started with us, still in lockdown back in July, which is mad to think about it. I also loved what you said yesterday. You were giving the opening statement at the IIEA development series, where you said we need to think more about an intergenerational approach to how we engage with the public. So clearly you're very engaged and motivated around this issue. So it's great to have you with us here this morning to give us a few opening remarks. Over to you, Minister. Thanks.
Thank you, very much for that. And yes, it does seem last July in some ways seems so long ago, and yet it's so recent in so many scenarios of thinking. And as I said yesterday, it's one of the strangest experiences for me as a minister, that my entire time I have never left the country. I have conducted all my meetings and all the engagements effectively. I think bar one where I actually got to meet someone in person have been through this means of virtual meetings or Zoom meetings. So it's very much a changed order in which we live. But obviously a big thank you today to Dóchas for the invitation to join you, to hear the findings of this important research into what the Irish public are really thinking and feeling about overseas development aid. I'm obviously very conscious in my role as the Minister that the work of Irish Aid, including our partnership with Dóchas, benefits from that goodwill and support of the Irish public. The effective development and cooperation is an expression of the Irish people's desire, I believe, to reach beyond our borders and build a much better and fairer world. And we are very fortunate that there's always been a high level of public support in this country for overseas aid. I think we're all aware of that and know that. Public opinion surveys through the years have really shown a consistent concern about the welfare that people have about others in the developing countries. Irish people consistently hold the view that Ireland should do its part in helping those furthest behind. However, while those surveys have always been helpful in highlighting the overall level of support, they don't really give you the full picture of what Irish public attitudes is to development aid. And that is why I'm really pleased that Irish Aid could fund this exciting additional research, and in addition, obviously, to our general support for Dóchas. The Worldview research project gives us, I think, a much deeper understanding of how Irish people think about overseas aid. It highlights the diversity of opinion that exists in levels of support, the reasons for the support, and indeed, as I'm well aware, why some doubt the value of aid. The importance, evidence base should help us all. The Department of Foreign Affairs, also you and Dóchas, effective targeting of communications and engagement is what we need now to reach that 21st century audience, which goes back to that point I was making about that intergenerational communication and how important that is. So it really boils down to increasing and deepening public support for international development. That will depend on how well we connect with the Irish public, including maximising all those new social media tools that are out there that some of us are very comfortable with, and other people I know have a big difficulty with or are not using to their full potential. But really, we must be maximising. The research, I think, gives us much to be hopeful about. It shows us the empathetic, outward-looking nature. In terms of aid, it's an essential part of our global connection and our shared humanity. Now, the COVID pandemic has reinforced, I think, the global sense of connection. As President Higgins said in his St. Patrick's Day address, we are reminded of our shared vulnerability, our interdependence, the need for an understanding that can fly past borders. And as I have made the point in many occasions while speaking, I think what has happened with COVID has really brought home to people that events which take place in a city or a town or a market on the far side of the world can have such huge impact on your everyday lives, that really that message of a global interconnection has really come out of COVID. And I think it's something that we must work on to keep when we move into the next stage of being past COVID through vaccinations and hopefully returning to a more regular way of life. However, obviously, the research also highlights that the outlook is not shared by all. A small but significant minority skeptical people increase about global engagement. They don't support Ireland's overseas development road. They doubt the impact. And while for many COVID-19 pandemic reaffirms that importance, as I said, of international, for others, it's led to a more insular nationalistic outlook. And indeed, that outlook has probably become more clear and outright and strong in terms of it being available for people to see than it was pre-COVID. We should not dismiss these viewpoints. The value of research is that it provides a basis for us to engage constructively with those who see things differently to us. it is important we listen to counter arguments and criticisms without falling into traps. And I think this research will help us frame type of respectful learning exchanges in which the flaws and failings within the aid sector can be acknowledged, while also allowing for misconceptions and falsehoods to be decommissioned. Development work can be complex. Like telling the story of your achievements must be simple, but not simplistic, engaging and encouraging. This research will help us frame and craft our outreach so that the positive impacts of all our work are disseminated effectively. The real test is how we use the information to improve our communication and outreach. And I'd like to leave you with 3 challenges in this regard. Firstly, that strive to engage beyond groups that already broadly agree with you. We need to go beyond preaching to the converted. It means moving beyond arguments that are only convincing those, with a certain outlook. We need to be thoughtful and develop tailored messages based on what matters to our audience. And I know for myself, I know from my own life that it is very easy to always get into that space that is more easy to live in, which is the space of having and working and communicating with those who are in agreement with you on most things that you believe in. We need to, as point 2, be more direct about the value of the aid programme to work, the importance of public support for the aid budget, and the Irish people should be aware of the important role they play in Ireland's overseas development work. And we need to also be sophisticated in addressing negative issues such as the perceptions of fraud or corruption. I'm not suggesting we become consumed with these issues, and there is a tendency that can happen as well. But however, we need to be proactively engaging on these challenges. It's not possible to convincingly communicate on the positive impact of aid without doing this as well, and tackling the misconceptions about aid. I'm very pleased that Dóchas is already moving to support the sector in using this research, including by developing the communications toolkit. And I encourage all of you to engage with the toolkit and with this ongoing research to improve our engagement with the Irish public. Without public support, and really it is absolutely crucial that we have public support, all the valuable and essential work we do would not be possible. So thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very much. That was really, really great and really interesting. I mean, as you say, the pandemic has almost only reinforced, I think, the importance of this work. But also we need to kind of look at it from a very positive, build on it from a positive standpoint, right, rather than from a crisis point. But I very much appreciate also your 3 challenges to us, which sets up this panel discussion very nicely. And in particular, that idea of how do we proactively engage with some of the challenges. But I love that idea of how do we think about these respectful learning spaces? Think of it more like that rather than a kind of, us preaching to others. So thank you very much for those great remarks. I hope we'll see you again as we journey through this process. And even more importantly, hopefully we can see you in person at some stage in the not too distant future.
I truly hope so, Suzanne. I truly, truly hope so.
We will. Thank you for your time. I know you have to disappear off at some stage, but really appreciate those opening remarks. Now, the moment that you've all been waiting for, this is where I get the drum roll out again. We are now going to turn to Ian Mcshane, the Executive Chairman from Behaviour and Attitudes, who's been doing this research for us. And he is going to take us briefly through what the findings are saying to us. So over to you, Ian. Thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, indeed, Minister. The most challenging part of these things for me is always getting my screen saved. So tell me, can we all see that? Yeah, wonderful, fantastic. I'm going to minimize that there. Look, without any further ado, I think I've got 20 minutes to take us through an overview, a summary of the most recent piece of research, which you essentially collectively have conducted. To remind ourselves, we surveyed over 3,000 Irish adults which is a huge sample size, a very large representative sample size of the views, the opinions, the behaviours, the attitudes of the Irish public. And then we subsequently conducted a comprehensive qualitative deep dive focusing on particular segments across the population by way of a series of 6 focus groups. So a very comprehensive and meaty piece of research in overall terms. And look, there's lots of positive data in there. There are lots of encouraging findings. There are some tidbits in there as to things we need to watch out for. And then some really good stuff we feel with regard to the different segments and groupings across the population who we just need to approach slightly different to each other when we're communicating our strategy over the following months and years. First of all, just at a very top line level, 3/4 of the entire population tell us when we ask them how they feel about levels of poverty in developing countries, the very first starting point, if you like, 3/4 of everybody out there tells us that, yes, actually, I am concerned to varying degrees, but I am concerned about levels of poverty in developing countries. Only 5% of the general population go so far as to suggest that they're not concerned about such poverty. And even more encouragingly, you could argue, we've got a similar proportion, again, 3/4 of the total population who tell us that they also feel that it's important that the Irish government provides overseas aid to help people in developing countries. So it's one thing feeling sympathetic and unsettled by poverty in developing countries. It's another thing to go further and say, no, that's not enough. I do believe essentially that it is important that the Irish government provides overseas aid to help alleviate these circumstances. Again, huge numbers, 3/4 of the population agreeing with that. Opinion is slightly more mixed and slightly more balanced when we ask them, well, okay, do you feel that the Irish government should increase, decrease, or in fact, basically leave as is the amount of overseas aid that's provided to developing countries? So there's about 3 in 10 say, yeah, actually, I do feel. Some of them because, you know, things are even more potentially acute in such countries since the pandemic. 3 in 10 saying, I actually believe the government should increase, should up its support for developing countries. A reasonably sizable 20%, you know, a minority, but 20% saying we actually feel in the current circumstances the government should roll back a little bit and dial down the support that it's giving. And then a sizable blob, if you like, 43% in the middle, who are saying steady as she goes for the next 12 months at least. So a balanced kind of a view with regard to that. We also essentially asked people, and this now moves us from the kind of more functional, kind of knee-jerk, you could argue, reaction of, yes, I think that we should be concerned about poverty in developing countries. Yes, I think that the government should do something about it, into the more deeply held emotional and psychological thinking behind that. And it's encouraging to note that 60%, 6 in 10 of everybody out there feels that we, the citizens of Ireland, have a moral obligation to personally support overseas aid. So it's not just a practical desire to see the government, for example, provide aid to such countries. It goes much, much deeper to a large proportion of the population, a healthy majority, in fact, who feel actually there is a moral imperative on all of us to do something about this. And again, that's very encouraging. And in fact, because of course, again, it is one thing to say that I feel there's a moral imperative to help such countries and that I feel that aid should be provided. If a majority of people were worried as to whether there was any point in such aid to begin with, we can rest assured that that's not the case. 80% basically of everybody out there do believe that overseas aid can help bring about positive change for those living in developing countries. So a vast majority of people say, assuming all the boxes are ticked and assuming that everything is transparent and the money is administered effectively and so on, then they're saying, actually, I do believe and I do feel that this money can actually be used for good cause. That is not to say, of course, that there aren't potential underlying, some of them more tangible barriers to overseas aid, either donating personally or advocating for overseas aid. And qualitatively, we did identify a set of interrelated factors that can act as real or potential barriers to supporting or advocating for overseas development aid. And for many people in the focus groups, these factors tended to unfold as something of a mental narrative that unfolded as they considered this issue as to whether they would or they wouldn't, or they should or they shouldn't support overseas aid. And the kind of the thought processes tends to start with, well, I wonder about the efficacy of this aid. Many, it's clear, don't have a clear idea as to precisely what areas aid is allocated to, other than short-term humanitarian purposes. So they begin to think about it and they go, well, actually, gosh, I wonder what is the money spent on? And even where there is an understanding, some people are much more sort of, basically gemmed up on these things, as you would expect across the population. Even where there is a reasonably clear understanding of what the money is spent on, the areas that it's allocated to, they're wondering, well, actually, do we know that the expenditure has been effective? In other words, has the money been well spent and has it had the desired effect? And then that kind of train of thought then leads people to wonder, well, actually, yeah, how exactly is that aid administered and who administers it? And if there are more than one or two bodies that administer the aid, how do they interact and ensure that it all works basically in a streamlined fashion? And here's where thinking is clearly, decidedly hazy. In other words, what is the precise role that the likes of the Irish government, okay, they understand that the Irish government has some role, multilaterals, and then development organizations, the role which those three strands of the equation are parts of the pieces of the jigsaw play in administering aid. And because their understanding of this juxtaposition of these players and these protagonists is decidedly hazy, that can give rise then to serious concerns around the percentage of aid that actually reaches its destination. First and foremost, by the time all administration costs have been accounted for, I wonder how much is left over. And then on the far right-hand side, then this issue which Minister Brophy referred to as something that we don't need to be obsessed by, but can't be ignored, can kick into play. In other words, this uncertainty as to how aid is managed from the time it, let's say, conceptually leaves its country of origin, in this case, Ireland, it's no wonder that so many are concerned then about the checks and the balances that would mitigate against monies being potentially misappropriated by corrupt officials in developing countries. So, in many cases, you can see the train of thought has a lot of gaps and haziness and fuzziness. And as is normal in human nature, what we tend to do is the tendency can be for some people to fill those gaps with worst case scenarios as to how exactly the aid has been administered, how much of it actually gets to its final destination, and then when it does get there, whether it's all actually used as I might have wanted it to. Now, of course, to counterbalance that, there are many more positive value motivators. In other words, underlying reasons as to why people do want overseas aid to be maintained, or do feel essentially that it's a good thing to donate to or to advocate for. And they tend to exist in these often subconscious psychological clusters, and the values tend to group together in people's minds as follows. So first of all, there's a general cluster. Now they are interrelated, they don't all sit, individually and distinctly. Some people will essentially be motivated by 2 or even 3 of these clusters of value motivators. But one of them anyway relates to this sense of humanitarianism, shared humanity, human rights. And as we can see, human and humanity is the one phrase or value that kind of is common to all of these. But first of all, people motivated by these values are by no means only referring to more short-term humanitarian aid. Just to make that point, they're referring often to all sorts of aid. And the overriding sentiment here is that of all individuals, regardless of their circumstances or indeed their geography, having equal rights to basic human requirements, the same human requirements that I, as somebody in a Western country, has automatically, the same basic human requirements as everybody else, as food, water, shelter, civil liberties, and all of this underpinned by a belief that we are all, at the end of the day, part of a global society. So a sense of humanitarianism, essentially. Then the next one is kind of justice and morality. The two things tend to mean the same thing to different people. And this is all about, regardless of the causes of the challenges faced by developing countries, you know, the climate or corruption or whatever it might be, this is a belief that we, as more privileged individuals, that privilege really just being due to a quirk of fate as to where we happen to be born, have a moral duty to help those less fortunate than ourselves. And this is a belief held even more strongly by those people who feel that more powerful Western countries are themselves a key cause of poverty in developing countries. Then we have solidarity as an underpinning or a driver or a motivator to overseas aid. Now, this is linked in the minds of some, it is a minority, but it is in the minds of some people, often cited by the minority who feel that the Irish have a special duty of care to developing countries due to our own history of famine and colonialism. So it's almost like the Choctaw tribe type motivation. It's, you know, we should be setting ourselves in the shoes of people in these countries because it's not that long ago historically that we were in the same situation. It's a minority, but it exists as a psychological motivator. And then finally, we have this one of duty, care, sympathy. This tends to be identified by older, more kind of working class individuals who may be motivated by these values. They're also more inclined to believe that citizens of such countries are at least partly responsible for their own misfortune, but still, due to a sense of sympathy, maybe it's okay to support developing aid. And then, of course, where that aid and how people want that aid to be dispersed is important. And there is a hierarchy. This is essentially how people feel such aid should best be administered. And the hierarchy deliberately has two sort of boxes across the top because they're mentioned almost in the same breath by people. First of all, health. So literally a life and death short-term benefit to the recipients, whether that be supplying medicine, sending medical professionals to such countries or building hospitals, but also education. People want to see aid used for such purposes on the basis that strong economies and democracies, in fact, are built on education, basic reading, writing, arithmetic, particularly with full access to such education to girls and women in such countries, but also industrial construction, agricultural training, and so on. So it needn't be second or third level or whatever education, good solid occupational training too. And then a lot of other people saying, no, absolutely health and education is important. We also need to keep an eye on infrastructure, roads, transport, networks, irrigation, sewage, those types of things, whereby a fully functioning country is a thriving country. And then a number of people, a minority admittedly, actually pointing out in the focus groups in particular, aid for sustainability alternative energy sources, solar energy to power industry and commerce, the reduction of such countries' reliance on oil and so on. And the more aid and the more people are aware that aid is in fact channeled for such purposes, the more comfortable they feel themselves about that. And then with regard to, who's best placed to administer the aid, they were asked how much of a difference they felt, if any rather, they felt each of the following can make to reducing poverty in poor countries. The United Nations and other international organizations comes in basically as the top choice or the top identified type of body in that regard. Businesses and corporations, although some people are skeptical as to what their motivations might be in helping to reduce poverty in poor countries. But look where development organizations and charities come in. They come in basically in a very healthy mid position. So a lot of people out there do feel that development organizations basically can make a significant contribution to reduce poverty in overseas countries. Yes, we need to keep an eye on trust. Here's where they were asked to what extent they trusted on a scale from 0 to 10 such organizations basically to, basically do the business with regard to overseas aid. And just to make the point that, there are lower levels of trust in overseas development aid organizations, for example, than there is in multilaterals and the Irish government. It's not that trust has fallen off the chart by any means, but just to kind of keep an eye on that and to be aware of that. And we took all of that quantitative data, that mound of statistics from those 3,000 people, and our statisticians churned it up, for want of a better term. And out of that data, out of that analysis came 6 key segments, each of whom will need to be targeted from a communications point of view in a slightly different fashion to essentially engage them more fully with the overseas aid agenda. And again, as Minister Brophy sort of pointed out at the outset, none of these essentially is a segment that can afford to be ignored. The ones towards the top are more highly engaged with the topic, with the agenda. They are the people who are largely already, those top 3 in particular, converted. Doesn't mean we don't preach to them, we talk to them. It's important to leverage their support, of course, as advocates out there. And then the further down we go, the less highly engaged people are essentially with the topic at the moment. It's not to say that they can't be engaged with, and the research gives us lots of clues and guides as to how those segments might be unlocked over the top segments. And just by the way, demographically, the further to the right we drift, the older in age group the segment is, the further to the left we drift, the younger each of those segments is. And then just to sort of give us a little bit of a flavour as to the views and the opinions and the stance of these some of these key segments with regard to overseas aid. You notice that top segment up there, global citizens, they're called global citizens because they're much more likely to define themselves as a global citizen than they are as a European citizen or a citizen of Ireland or a citizen indeed of the local community. That's why they're called global citizens. And there's 700,000 of them out there. It's 1 in 5 of the total Irish adult population. And this segment, these people are strongly inclined towards the view that developing countries can make progress given the right support. They're deeply concerned about poverty in such countries at a personal level. They also place more trust than average in overseas aid organizations and multilateral organizations. And its motivation, their motivation to help developing countries is based on a broad mix of values and sentiments. In fact, a good smattering of all of those values that we looked at a few minutes ago. The segment is also quite critical of more powerful countries and their role over the years in propagating poverty in developing countries. They are our global citizens. Our community activists then, also very highly engaged with the subject. It's 10% of all adults, which is still quite a sizable 370,000 individuals. Practically everybody in this segment expresses concern about poverty in developing countries. Approaching 3/4 of them are of the view that such countries can make real progress with the correct supports in place. They're motivated to support helping developing countries on the basis of basic human rights and this sense of shared humanity. They are more likely to attribute poverty in these countries to the behaviour and policies of wealthy, powerful countries. They're our community activists. Our European multilateralists, again, high up in terms of overall levels of engagement, are again, there's almost 800,000 of these people. The vast majority of those European multilateralists are concerned about poverty. Again, in developing countries, they're more inclined than the average individual to support aid due to a sense of justice and morality. They're kind of attributing poverty in such countries to a mix of causes. They indicate high levels of trust in multilateral organizations like the EU and the UN compared to all other relevant bodies. And again, just because disengaged nationalists are, as the term suggests, the least engaged of the segments, there's only 10% of all adults fall into this segment, get 370,000 odd individuals, doesn't mean that it's not important that we understand them. They are entirely unsympathetic at the moment to the notion of helping developing countries. They essentially believe that government incompetence and the irresponsible behavior of citizens of those countries themselves are the root causes of poverty there. They're much more focused on basically looking after people in Ireland first and foremost, particularly since the advent of the pandemic. And then to sort of bottom out, if you like, on that, and again, it has been a whistle-stop tour of the research, just to make the point that when we're targeting each segment, and we have one of these done for each of the 6 segments, but just on these kind of first 3 segments to begin with, we need to understand what its bullseye audience is so the media people can target them, what the media channels are so that, you know, those communicators and planners can know where to place the messaging, what their socio-cultural priorities are so that we have the bigger picture, what matters to them on a day-to-day basis, and of course then a deep dive on communications wise, what overseas aid messaging is most likely to cut through to them. So for example, for our global citizens, our bullseye audience is 20 to 40 years, single pre-family, so younger, in other words, ABC1 kind of white collar, urban, college educated individuals. Media channel wise, these over indexed on multimedia digital channels compared to everybody else. So news websites, also social media, podcasts and so on. So multimedia, interactive digital channels, they're more likely than average to consume those channels. Socio-culturally, these are global citizens. That's how they see themselves. That's how they actually define themselves. They're more focused than the average individual on climate change, housing, fake news, the rise of populism globally. And they also tend to have a more positive financial outlook, by the way, than many of the other segments. Overseas aid-wide, aids they see and support aid on the basis of humanitarian and moral reasons. It's all around addressing exploitation by powerful countries as they see it, and they'd like to see it administered by multilaterals and aid organizations on the ground. Our community activist bullseye audience, again, younger, single, young family, college. There's a female college educated, there's a female skew here. Media channel-wise, a mix of traditional channels and also social media. Socio-culturally, local community and national citizens is how they see themselves. Again, they're focused on housing and trying to crack that issue at a local level, at a national level, but also climate change, economic inequality at all levels and in all its guises, developing countries, and again, the rise of populism. Focusing in and honing in on overseas aid as a basic human right, and due to a sense of this shared humanity, and it's all around for them addressing a global economic system which they feel basically favors rich countries and basically debilitates against developing countries. And then finally, our European multinationalists, bullseye audience wide, these are ABC1 urban, absolutely 55 years plus, so they are older than the first 2 segments. They're consuming the full mix of traditional media touch points. Remember, they're older, so they're a little bit more traditional in their media consumption patterns. Socio-culturally and attitudinally, they see themselves as kind of a blend of European and Irish citizens. their focus is skewed towards health services in Ireland, actually, not least due to their own older age profile, no doubt. And then overseas aid, messaging wise, aid for reasons of justice and morality. They'd like to see it basically administered by Irish government via aid organisations overseen by the multilaterals. So as I say, within, I think, just over 20 minutes, that is hopefully a good, decent and reasonable overview of the research.
Thank you, Ian, very much. No, that was great and very comprehensive. Just to rest assured, if you didn't catch it all and see all those documents, they are on the toolkit. Also worth noting that we will be holding a practitioners workshop in the next couple of months so we can really go into the detail. But thanks for that, Ian. Again, I think you've all seen there, we're not just seeing some of these kind of broad results, but really going into the detail around who is this audience that we really need to reach out there. I am a bit conscious of time, so I do want to go on to our next speaker, but can I encourage you also, everyone on the call, in the chat, comments, surprises, what's new from what you're just seeing there? And if you've got any questions, please keep them coming in the chat. I'm going to hand over quickly now, if that's okay, to Keelan, the Strategy Director for Ask Direct. Keelan, you're going to help us begin to unpack this. Give us some sense of how unique are some of these findings from the work that you do or from the many surveys that you look at both in Ireland and overseas. So over to you, Keelan. Thanks.
Thanks, Suzanne. Just give me a sec to share my screen and I will start. So yeah, I am a strategy director for Ask Direct. And I've also worked in the UK context as well. So both with Ask Direct and personally, I've worked with a number of different international aid organisations, plans, Save the Children, around Trócaire. I see Gwen is here. Hi, Gwen. And I know Eamon and a few other people I've worked with before. And we are, you know, we're coming from a fundraising perspective. So let me just go full screen on this. Yeah, here we go. So what from the context of the kind of research and insights that we have access to, it is very much coming from the supporter segment. So there's a couple of caveats, little pinches of salt that I'm going to frame this with, and then I'll get on to what I found kind of the interesting, what I want to back up, what's been said by Ian, and also just point out maybe some subtleties from the supporters' point of view. So this is the two caveats. Number one, you're not your audience. When we work with organizations on strategy workshops, creative workshops, if you work in this sector, you probably very much identify with that kind of global citizen identity. We're immersed in the social justice space. All that vocabulary and way of thinking is second nature to us. But that's not always the case, as you can see from this research. So just bearing that in mind, you know, kind of marketing 101. And secondly, what people say to you is not always what they think, and it's not always the same as what they will actually do. So that little Venn diagram, you know, it's not a perfect circle. Those things overlap, but they're not the same. So bearing all that in mind, we've done my insights here are based on kind of qualitative interviews, hundreds of donors to various causes, including international development, but not exclusive to international development. Our quantitative supporter surveys, which we tend to do with our clients every 2 to 3 years, and then also repeal results. So that's where we look at what they're actually doing in contrast to what they might say to us in a qualitative interview or they say in their surveys. And the other thing I will say is that from a supporters donor point of view, these are the two segments that I recognize particularly. So it's those older people, the European multilateralists and national pragmatists. Those are the kind of people we talk to when we talk to supporters. That's your supporters are over-indexing in those two segments in the context of this research. So we've worked with, we've partnered with with Blue Frog Fundraising a couple of times, who are a UK fundraising agency, and actually where I used to work in London. And they do a lot of international research in the Anglophone world anyway, looking at supporter motivations and how they compare and contrast. And where we fit in Ireland is quite interesting. And you can see there, you know, what people say and what people think is different. So in the States, you know, donors will tend to say, oh, I'm not doing it for the recognition. You know, I don't need the big plaque. But when you dig into that a little deeper, they're happy to have the big plaque as long as they're not seen to be asking for it. It's okay to talk about and to show your generosity. In the UK, they're a little more circumspect. They'll also say, I'm not doing it for the recognition, but they feel good when others know about their giving. Whereas in Ireland, that's not really the case at all. We don't talk about our giving to other people. It's viewed as kind of a private issue, and it's an issue coming from duty, not guilt, but a positive duty. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And this is a quote from someone I spoke to recently, actually, and that kind of sums up a lot of the attitudes that you'll hear supporters say. You know, they have a responsibility, they want to share their luck. It's not that they are trying to ameliorate any guilt in any sense, but they have a duty. And that comes from, I think, several specific touch points in the Irish cultural context. Here's a couple of donor quotes that illustrate what I'm talking about, because I noticed in the longer results, kind of religion comes down way at the bottom of what people say their motivators are, and that might be true. But I would urge you, if you have a religious ethos as an organization, or you know that you have donors with that who share, you know, religious ethos, that you not erase that. Because for Irish people, it's embedded into our culture and our upbringing, and our even sometimes our family traditions, and that's where the religious angle can come in. It's not that they're donating or supporting a charity because they believe that Jesus wants them to, like, you know, US donors, US religious and Christian donors will say that to you. In Ireland, it's not, you know, people will tell us they're not at all religious and that doesn't motivate their giving, but could we call back later because mass is on? You know, it's much more subtle and much more embedded in our view of ourselves as Irish people. So there is that kind of that sense of duty, that sense of it's a thing that you should be doing, and therefore I do it. And moving on, kind of picking up on that sense of Irish identity as well. Another theme we tend to see is that they, you know, and this relates to Ian's earlier point about solidarity as one of the kind of motivators. Irish people, in contrast to people in the UK, I think, see themselves much more, you know, that they have a kind of commonality with the people, the people that the beneficiaries of their donations in overseas countries. They feel, you know, especially with these older age groups, people tend to have, you know they have a cousin or a brother or an uncle, you know, who was in a religious order and worked abroad. They feel much closer to those countries and to the work, and they feel that they share much more of an identity. And I think that some of that is a very post-colonial thing as well, and a big contrast with the UK. Irish people value localness, but for international development organizations, that localness is embedded in how the charity works in their community, or how they see the charity operating in their community, and also in Irish people working abroad. So this is just something to be aware of when you're looking at, okay, how do we build on this? How do we pull this through into our communications? Whenever we do appeals with an Irish signatory working abroad, an Irish, you know, the appeal is from an Irish person working abroad, that generally does better. And that's, I think, because people see themselves acting through that fellow Irish person abroad. And I realize that can cause logistical difficulties, because obviously for most of the organizations, the people who are actually doing the work on the ground are the people who live and work and are from that country. So that's just something to kind of bear in mind, that they see themselves as working through fellow Irish people abroad, rightly or wrongly. And the other thing I want to pick up on from what Ian said is that focus on the tangible stuff, you know, health, education, and water, kind of the top three for both of those both of those segments that I'm focusing on. You know, when we ask why they, you know, what their donations are going to be used for, or what they would like their donations to be used for, this kind of thing comes up a lot. And it's not that they don't understand that climate change impacts on all of this, but there is a kind of plausibility problem. You know, if we're asking someone to chip in €50, they know that's not going to save, you know, they know that's not going to solve climate change. It's about, you know, for them, they want it to have a tangible, immediate effect. They know that climate change is driving a lot of the need in those countries. But it's about the tangible actions then that need to be taken, and how they can have an impact on those things. And obviously, you know, if you're at all familiar with an organization like Charity Water, they have operationalized that to a massive extent, and it works very, very well for them. The next thing I want to pull over is this theme of trust. And trust is an interesting one, especially in the context of recent headlines in Ireland. Irish donors tend to, in contrast to UK donors, we're just a bit nicer. And I'm quoting, you know, I'm quoting a British person when I say that. We tend to trust the organisation until they give us a reason not to. So people just assume I'm a good person. I support this organisation, therefore they are a good organisation, unless I hear differently from somewhere else. But particularly for international development supporters, they feel a bit more, they do trust you, they do see you as experts, they're not into the detail, they are, as Ian said, quite hazy about how the work actually gets done. In the most part. Now you'll get some very engaged, very savvy people who really want to know and will read every page of your annual report, but for the most part, they don't want the details. You know, like this woman says, you're the pilot, they're just on the plane. You've got all the training and education, you're pointing the plane where it needs to go, and they're just helping you do that, and that's fine. And the flip side of that is they tend to feel a bit more remote from international organisations compared to other causes in Ireland. They don't feel like they get the kind of, they don't feel as close to you, and that's a risk, especially if you are looking at adding layers to communications, to tailoring your communications and your offers for different segments in the population. Because when a supporter feels less close to an organisation, they are more likely to stop supporting you. So that's just a kind of something to bear in mind. It's a bit of a risk for the sector as a whole, and there are ways to ameliorate that and shore that up in your communications. And the last thing I want to pull out, again, based on, you know, pulling out from what Ian was saying, and this is a super, super long quote, but I included it all because when you read it all, you can almost hear this man's voice in your head. And this feeds back into the plausibility of what I was saying. You know, what builds trust is showing impact. And supporters, when we speak to them, feel like they don't get enough long-term feedback. And that then feeds into this plausibility problem of like, well, is this just a drop in the ocean? You know, am I really helping to fix this problem, or is it just perpetual? And so that's something that's well within your control as organizations to be able to show that impact and give that feedback, especially that longer term feedback. And the other thing to pull out about this quote is that he says, I'd talk to my grandchildren and I'd say, look what happened. So that feeds back into that. Giving is what you do as an Irish person. This man wants to actually teach his grandchildren that this is what you do and this is why we do it, and I'd like you to continue that family tradition kind of with me. So those are, I suppose, I realize we're really tight on time, so I was trying to pull out the top kind of comparisons and contrasts and caveats based on our research with, as I say, supporters. We don't tend to talk to the people who, you know, don't care about charities or don't support charities at all. So yeah, any questions on that, I'm happy to answer them, or you can contact me through here, any stage.
Brilliant, Keelan. Thank you very much. Kind of there's so much kind of food for thought there, I think, but really appreciated that. Just one immediate question came through the chat, I think, from Elena Idea. Going back to this point, Keelan, around using Irish representatives. People want to engage through Irish people. Can we understand that a little bit more? When you say engagement, is that through kind of giving or understanding development, whatever? Elaine's just asking a bit more on that.
Definitely through giving, which is not to say that, well, when we look at appeals, and is it coming from an Irish person working abroad, or is it coming from someone in that working in that country who's not Irish? The Irish person will generally beat the non-Irish person every time. And that may be the case to a greater or lesser extent, depending on what the type of campaign is. Is it mobilization? Is it petition signing? But certainly in results, that's very clear.
Great. Just begins to get a sense that nothing's that easy in this field, is it? Because at the same time, that pressure or that criticism, isn't there, out there around that kind of white savior type approach, and these are the kind of things that we need to kind of struggle with. Yes,
absolutely. It's a juggle.
Yeah, I'm going to have to move us on, because we've got a great panel with us as well, who are going to kind of say, well, again, very practically, what can this mean? I would ask people to keep coming up with the comments and questions. What's surprising you from what you've seen so far? What are you worried about in terms of challenges from what you're hearing right now? But the other thing I want to hear just now, just to make sure that we're all still here, still we've got about 75 people on the line. How are you feeling right now? Okay, you've just seen this survey. I've got really good kind of insight, a lot there, but how are you feeling about it? We're going to get a Mentimeter code now. Just what's that one word? Are you feeling excited? Are you feeling depressed? Have we suddenly got you really nervous? You just want to dive under the pillow and not come out again. How are you feeling about these survey results? Let's get a word cloud going from all of you, so that we know you are there. Please, as you probably know by now, the Mentimeter's there and the code. We'll try and get into that word cloud at the end of this. Thank you very much indeed, Ian and Keelan, for setting up, giving us the survey results and a little bit of the context. We're now going to go to our panelists to say, well, so what? You've got the data. What does that actually mean when it comes to fundraising, to the campaigning work that we do, and more importantly, when we are now engaging with others in Ireland? So welcome to our panelists, Eamon Sharkey, we have Karen Smith, and we have Bulalani Mpako on the line as our panelists. You are all very welcome. I am going to first turn to you, Eamon, if that's okay. You're the Director of Fundraising and Marketing with Goal. I know you are a very active member of the Worldview steering group, and I know you and I have talked about this project for years now. You've been very, very engaged with it. But now at this stage, Eamon, okay, we've been talking about it a lot. What are you going to do with this stuff when it comes to fundraising? Give us a sense of what you think. How's this research going to make a difference?
Great, thanks, Suzanne. And let me just start by saying thanks to yourself and all the team at Dóchas and the Department of Foreign Affairs, Irish Aid, and also Ian and his team at Behaviours and Attitudes for this initiative. As you said, it's timely, it's valuable, and I think provides a roadmap for the sector on how we can begin to build a unified lexicon, a unified message that will, I think, not only enable and maintain our current levels of support amongst the Irish public, but hopefully help to evolve and grow this support into the future as our society, as our culture, as the landscape begins to change. I'm here, of course, today representing Goal, but I think on both a professional and a personal level, like all of you and everyone on this call, I have a huge passion for ensuring our citizens, our society, we have a deep appreciation for Ireland's ODA programme and the values that our dynamic development community here in Ireland are built on. As you said, Suzanne, I think it's fair to say this is not the first research project that we've had as a sector, but I think it's markedly different than what has come before. Really, really chalk and cheese. The depth of the research, I think, is really impressive. It's moved past just giving us that snapshot of perceived ODA support into something that is much more rounded, holistic, robust, and I think unpacks the motivations and the why of the attitudes and the perceptions that people hold. Understanding our audiences as a fundraiser, as communicators, as people working in public engagement, it's absolutely a precursor in helping to shape attitudes and behaviours. And I think this research is, it's a joint leap forward in that respect. So as you say, what have we learned and how can we use it as a sector and as individual organisations within this sector? Because I think, I'm not sure who made the point earlier on, but I'd always say that insight without action is absolutely a waste of time. So it's really important that we, as the practitioners in the sector, grab the learnings and put them into action as we go forward. So what are the learnings? For me, the things that have stood out, I think it's fair to say that the research is telling us overseas aid is not a hot topic. It was at the bottom of the pile when people mentioned the top 3 issues of concern. And on first glance, like that feels like bad news. But I think if we unpack it a little bit, it's probably not such a big surprise. The average person, all of us here on the call, we've so many things going on in our lives, real practical daily issues. We can't expect the average person to dedicate a huge amount of their headspace on a daily or a weekly basis to this subject. I think from the research we saw that issues like the pandemic, health, education, housing, these are all much more immediate concerns in people's lives. So the ray of light here is not that overseas aid is the most important topic. Really what we can take solace from is that when asked about their support for overseas aid in different ways, the majority of people are still very supportive. And there was three examples that stood out for me. The one I think Ian touched on was that a net 75% of people say they are concerned about poverty in developing countries, a brilliant foundation to build on. More people than not said they believe that Ireland can afford to increase our overseas aid. And it was a net 31% of people that genuinely believe we should increase that amount. So these are really positive messages, positive things we can draw from this. But of course, we can't rest on our laurels as a sector and as practitioners. The shifts we've seen around the world, the so-called right-wing swings, the divisive and the often toxic narratives we've seen online and elsewhere, they are knocking on our door. So we need to be proactive and get ahead of them while we can, as a community, as a sector. I thought it was also very interesting in the research that while overseas aid may be low on the list of topics that people are most concerned about, the issues that people do feel strongly about are very much often connected to development. So some of the examples there that stood out to me were people are very concerned about global diseases and pandemics. They're concerned about climate change. They're concerned about wealth inequality and war and conflict. And these are issues that our organizations are working on every single day. So perhaps there's something here for us in figuring out how we link these issues that people are concerned about more to our work on poverty alleviation and humanitarian response, linking these other issues that people are interested in into how we communicate our work. I also found it really interesting and notable that human rights is cited as the most important reason to help those in developing countries, and that's quite a stretch. Again, I think that's a topic that's deeply embedded in our organizations and it guides our work, but I don't think it's necessarily a frame or a lens that we communicate our work through enough. I think that's a real practical takeaway we can take from this research straight away. Moving a little bit from the conceptual to the practical, I think the research has helped to shine light on how people are influenced, when and where they're having their views shaped. Television, maybe perhaps surprisingly, still ranks highly. But I think a key takeaway there is that the blend between traditional TV and online streaming services is now more blurred than ever. And that's important in our media buying, our targeting as well. It wasn't a surprise, I don't think, that word of mouth, good old fashioned discussions, conversations are still critical in shaping people's views. But I think if we're really honest with ourselves, even that takes a very different form today. And that can include everything from conversations over a cup of tea at the kitchen table to people sharing news articles in WhatsApp groups. And again, as marketeers, as communicators, as public engagement experts, that's something we can't be blind to. We need to take that into how we work and how we deliver our messages. Social media definitely came out again as an important influencer. Again, not a surprise. But I think that we know that can be for good and ill. And I think increasingly, it's probably becoming a net negative factor, in particular when it comes to issues that can be spun as divisive or maybe used to center on culture and identity wars. So I think that rush we've seen within the sector and within wider society to social media over the past 10 years. We maybe need to be a little bit more considered going forward, and the days of just throwing content up online or going straight to social media for everything, I think maybe they're beginning to fade, and we need to be more considerate and strategic in how we use social media. I think there was a comment in the chat bar that I think really resonated with me. We need to probably do a better job of communicating where overseas aid fits in, along with the role of INGOs, and separate the issues that unfortunately a lot of people wrap up all together in this area. So I saw in the research that issues of corruption and perceived incompetence are emerging as reasons not to support ODA. So we need to be really clear and effective in communicating how our work is not related to that. There are some links there, but our work is effective, it's positive, and it delivers impact as well. Ian mentioned trust. I think we've been talking about trust in our sector for a long time, and we've seen a recovery in trust over the in recent years, but it's been slow and it continues to be fragile. But I think there are important insights in this research in particular, and I think Keelan mentioned this in her session. Simply by having contact with individuals, face-to-face contact with individuals, we can increase their level of trust in our institutions and in our organizations. And I think this is a really important signpost as we develop our public engagement programs, our communication strategies, and our fundraising strategies into the future. Remote is good, digital is good. We've all got so used to it, but genuine human interaction delivers an added dividend. I think that creates that trust and loyalty. So I suppose, where do we go from here? The segments and the associated characteristics developed by Ian and his team, they give us a framework to shape and target our communications, our public engagement, our fundraising. The depth and the detail, I think, provides confidence, certainly to me and to other people in the sector, that we have a really robust model. The size of this research, it gives confidence. I think that's really important if we're going to bring everybody with us in this journey. Just still a lot of work to do by all of us in our organizations. Just knowing that human rights resonates with many of these segments isn't enough. We need to now craft and develop our messages. We need to test them methodically, comprehensively, at scale, to gain a deeper understanding of what triggers are there, how we can move people from A to B and really influence their thoughts, their thinking, their attitudes, and their behaviors. I suppose, thinking very specifically about fundraising, I think this can potentially give us a really strong, clear pathway to move beyond a lot of the tired narratives of aid and poverty, and help us move confidently into a place where we can talk about wider issues, approaches to global citizenship, solidarity, justice, that resonate and deliver. There's always that natural tension between fundraising in the short term and using tried and tested narratives, and moving on to something more progressive that's more future focused. And probably to finish, maybe the biggest challenge I think we have that emerges from this research and these conversations that we're having, facilitated by Dóchas, is how do we develop a shared and common narrative as a sector that brings the public along with us while still maintaining our own identity as organizations. We all have our own USPs, our own DNA. So we need to be both pursuing our differentiation as individual organizations, but in a way that provides or creates a common front with consistent messaging. So I'll finish there, but just let me say to finish, say thanks to Suzanne and the team at Dóchas, the Minister, I think certainly and the Department and Irish Aid for driving this initiative forward. I think all of us would probably agree this has to be a long-term commitment. We have to do this over the course of years, not months, and that's going to be critical to safeguard that public support for ODA. So on that, I'll pass back to yourself, Suzanne.
Great, thanks, Eamon, and that was really great insight in a short time. And I'd say I love that idea. We've got to move from that tired narrative. I'm going to move on to Karen, but Eamon, while I do that, I am going to ask you to consider a question that was posted in the chat by Quiva, and I think it kind of speaks to what you're saying. We have to move away from this tired narrative, but at the same time, we heard earlier about this kind of people do actually like to see Irish people talking about this stuff. How do we move the dial around this white saviour image, this white saviour representation? I'm going to leave that a short, easy question for you to consider, and I'll come back to you. But I'm now going to move on to the next panelist, if that's okay. That's Karen Smith. She's the head of campaign marketing with Trócaire. Great to have you with us, Karen. I know you are also an active member of the steering group, and you have a particular passion for insight-led public-facing campaigns, which of course is what hopefully this survey is all about and will help you in your work. Maybe you can share with us, particularly from that campaign marketing perspective, how are you going to use this data? Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Suzanne. I fear a lot of what I have prepared here may have been covered already, so I hope I don't bore people. And just to clarify, it's Karen Casey from Troker that's on the steering group, not myself, just to not to take credit for that. So first of all, thanks for a really interesting presentation so far. It's been really great to hear the views of the Irish public in such a comprehensive and really kind of thought-provoking way. It's also amazing to see 3,000 as a sample size. That's so robust, and it really gives us a clear focus on the why as a build on the what. So I sort of, as you said there, I really see this study as a real asset to informed planning. I'm a firm believer in how vital the external perspective is to enable insight-driven decision-making, because otherwise we could be a bit in an echo chamber ourselves. Without listening and understanding to the public perception in this ever-changing society that we all live in, how could we ever address the challenges or leverage the opportunities? That would be my kind of starting point. A couple of observations, and then I've divided it into the challenges and opportunities as I see them. So a few observations. So many of the findings that we saw this morning and that I was reading previous to this really match with what we've been seeing in Troker through our own research and insight. In particular, the kind of shared humanity as a key driver for helping, the real desire to see the impact of overseas aid over time, and the fact that the priorities that were cited for investment were really tangible, the health, education and water. That's, you know, that's kind of what we see as well. As a marketeer for many years, I'm not surprised to see that video has been cited as one of the most evocative ways to engage people, but I also am not surprised to see the role that all the different media plays. And it really supports the power of an integrated campaign to get the right message to the right people at the right time. A few of the big challenges that struck me from the research. First of all, the local focus. And we really see the category of overseas aid becoming a niche cause, and that kind of phrase that we've all heard many times of charity begins at home. As a sector, we obviously aim to drive awareness of global development issues and how the development aid is making a difference. But we know that the charity sector itself is extremely cluttered with over 10,000 charities registered in Ireland. And we know that media is fragmented as well. So that cutting through of that message is really tough. It's a real challenge. So I feel that the category message needs to be really focused and simple. And being focused and simple is easier said than done. There's so much to say, but it's really hard to kind of cut through that with something that's really going to create change. Trust has come up a lot this morning, and I thought it was interesting in the research when asked, you know, who people trust, and they talked about people they have contact with. But in most cases for overseas aid, due to the distance, you know, people don't have contact directly. So that can lead to distrust. And I saw a quote in some of the qual of the research from one of the participants, you know, does it go to the right people at the right time and into the right places? So without seeing the impact, you know, that's a kind of real challenge for trust. Another challenge for us, particularly on the marketing and fundraising side, is the kind of negative consumer sentiment post-COVID. And that particularly came out in the younger cohort. So, you know, 54% feeling the economy would get worse and 31% their own household situation. So what does that mean for a sector that, you know, from our perspective, we need to raise funds, but also to engage people with our issues. Diversity and inclusion came up as well, and 64% agreed that the Black Lives Matter movement has highlighted the need to address inequality in the sector. And that particularly came out strongly for the younger cohort. So I feel we really need to show the authentic human story, but in a respectful way. So that's a big challenge for us to address as a sector. But it's not all doom and gloom. I see lots of opportunities coming out here. I'd mentioned before that phrase of charity begins at home, but it really doesn't end there. The research is showing, as it's been mentioned a few times, that, you know, the majority of people, most Irish people, are concerned about poverty in developing countries. And that over-indexes in the over 65, but also really encouragingly, it over-indexes in the 18 to 24 group. So that's great. They're also concerned about what's happening around the world, hugely so. And as Ian mentioned earlier, 60% feel that moral obligation, which, as Ian said, is kind of closer to the heart than just the head. This whole issue of COVID being so global and really highlighting that international cooperation in addressing global problems is more important than ever. And I know that was mentioned earlier, 81% agreeing with that. And that's a real open door to engaging with the Irish public, to encourage more, to encourage more interest in other global issues, that, to take that global perspective on other issues. I felt personally that there was an opportunity to maybe raise awareness and educate on some of the other root causes of poverty, which didn't really come through on the list that was shown, like climate change. So the ones that came through were kind of corruption and, I suppose, man-made things, and climate change, where we also have an impact on this side of the world, and it's really creating poverty on the other side of the world. So I think that's really important. As a marketeer, the segments I think are fantastic. I've obviously gone through them in detail, but I'd love to go through them in even more detail and explore them. But it really gives us an opportunity as a sector to address the different audiences with tailored messages, which is one way to cut through that cluttered media space that I talked about earlier. And there's a real opportunity to take a collaborative approach. So, public engagement, development education, comms and campaigning, fundraising and marketing, all of us here today have complementary skills, and we all have a role to play in engaging with the segments, to really meet them where they are now and bring them on a journey, tell them the story that we want to tell them. And finally, to end, I really think that there's an opportunity there, because there is hope. The majority believe that overseas aid can bring about positive change for the lives of people in developing countries. And that's a great sort of a launch pad for us to go from. So there's a lot of challenges, but, there is hope, and there is a lot of really, really interesting insight there that can help us to develop really impactful plans. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that, and for that positivity. And just interesting, how COVID has changed, what we need to do in terms of that collective narrative. And as you say, look, there is a real kind of opportunity, because people see that sense of connectedness and that global solidarity. But at the same time, and I know a lot of our members were saying it by the end of last year, you couldn't get anything into the media unless it said COVID and Ireland on it. And I think we're still very much in that climate. But then again, maybe there is hope. It's extraordinary how the terrible tragedy in India really is gathering everywhere in the news, and yet issues like Tigray and Myanmar barely get a mention. So no room for complacency, as we all know, but there is hope. So Karen, thanks very much for those reflections. Last but not least, to Bulelani, great to have you with us. You're a spokesperson for MASI, the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland, and you bring a particularly kind of PR, advocacy and policy expertise to your work with local communities on the important issue of asylum seeker rights. You're very welcome. I suppose I'm going to be asking you a slightly different question, and not so much, or maybe what you take from the research, but in particular, from your own experience, how can we engage with that all-important group around what we call the new Irish, both at local and national level? It'd be great to get some of your thoughts and perspectives on that. Over to you, Bulelani. Thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne, for the invitation, and thank you for organizing the discussion. Very encouraging report that there is a lot of support, public support for overseas development aid, but of course, raising similar concerns that many people in the diaspora would have raised, particularly around corruption. So if you think about people, for instance, from South Africa, you mentioned South Africa, we always think about corruption whenever the government talks about money, even the budget, when anybody in the public sphere mentions money, the first thought that comes to mind is corruption. So if you were talking about an organization doing development aid work in South Africa, you would have quite a lot of people concerned about who is managing that money, how are they, is it actually going to reach the people that it's meant to reach? Because we know from experience of our public financing that it actually never really reaches the people that it's meant to reach most of the time. And so it's encouraging to see that there is also a concern from Irish people who provide the finances or who donate money to overseas development aid, that they're concerned about where the money, whether it's used responsibly. But from us as the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland and constitute a diaspora community in Ireland, would be concerned about representation of people from developing countries. So if you talk about, for instance, I remember Gillian mentioned the child who is starving, who people want to see that the starving child has actually survived. But you question the use of a starving child to represent poverty in the developing world. For a lot of people, for instance, in Ireland, who come, particularly asylum seekers, will be framed as welfare scroungers, people who come poor from poor countries. We are poor. We have come here to take advantage of the Irish welfare system, and that doesn't just come from there. It isn't plucked from thin air. People don't dare take that from thin air. Primarily because there is an architecture, one of media framing, of migration in general, but also development aid organizations who portray people in the global south as poor and impoverished. And so we get a lot of Irish people say, for instance, go back to your home country. We can help you while you are in your country. We don't understand the difference between the need to develop a country, but also the persecution that goes on in a particular country. So that quite a lot of people who misunderstand or confuse the two. And that for us stems from how people of ethnic minorities, primarily from developing countries into the EU, are portrayed by both the press, but also developing aid agencies. And so for us, it's very important that you consider how in your adverts, you've seen them a lot on social media. I would see them on the timeline of organizations advertising their work, but also soliciting donations through using images of one poor people or blind child, or and there's a comedian, South African comedian, who makes the joke about a child on a UNICEF advert who's always sitting somewhere with a fly around his face, buzzing all over his color. Couldn't you get rid of the fly before you took the picture of the child? And so that negative portrayal for us as a diaspora community actually misrepresents what it is that we are as a diaspora. But while it might represent a reality for somebody in the communities we come from, in our country of origin, for us to be seen like that on the streets of Dublin, it actually just not represent our reality. Because for one, poor and impoverished people where we come from can't afford to buy plane tickets and fly to Ireland. So the idea that I would be here to take advantage of your wonderful welfare system, that's so true, because the Gear Institute again tells us that most people of African descent in Ireland are actually highly educated, and they would constitute an acute minority if you went to the African continent and look at the level of education. And so most migrants who live in Ireland would come from not necessarily a middle-class background, but they would have a certain degree of privilege. They would have enjoyed a certain degree of privilege back home. If you have a third level education qualification in Africa, you are part of the 1% that is a privilege. And so there is quite a lot of contestation and criticism of development aid organizations, particularly in the way they frame their fundraisers around using people to show examples of how their work is making an impact. The movement for asylum seekers in Ireland, if you go through our social media, we do a lot of donations. We ask people, for instance, to donate. The last one we did was when an asylum seeker in direct provision needed a bicycle, couldn't afford to, because get 38 euro per week as weekly allowance when you're living in direct provision. Couldn't afford to buy a bicycle. We asked Irish people to donate a bicycle, and we connected the donor to the actual asylum seeker, so they delivered it to the asylum seeker. You never saw a picture of the asylum seeker getting a bicycle on the Musty Twitter feed or on the Musty website. So we'd never take pictures of people, but we take pictures of things that we do. So if, for instance, like we were doing a campaign to provide laptops and tablets to students in direct provision who were left out when everybody was told to homeschool, when colleges were closed and people needed to study from home in direct provision centers. But you didn't see us, the movement of asylum seekers, posting pictures of people holding the laptops that we provided over 200 new laptops. But you would have seen other organizations who do the same work of providing supports to people who are marginalized, posting those pictures of people to show the impact of their work. I think for us, it works as a movement of asylum seekers. We are able to reach the people that we want to reach in terms of the people who support the work that we do, financial support the work that we do, but also the people that we want to serve without necessarily making taking photographs of people and posting them online on social media platform or advertising and using them to generate more income. There are ways of doing that without necessarily portraying people in a manner that makes other people uncomfortable. So if you were to ask yourself, I'm going to wrap up now. If you were to ask yourself as a development aid agency or organization, when you are crafting your campaign, the one question that you need to ask, who is it for? Is it for the person? Who is the target of your audience? Does the target need to see this? I can tell you that no Black person wants to see a Black child starving to near death. We don't want to see that. It's not that it doesn't happen. We know that it happens, but it's something that stirs up quite a lot of emotive issues. Like there were times when in my childhood we were actually starving. We've gone to bed on an empty stomach, only drinking water. We're lucky to have clean water. But do I want to see that as a Black person? If you asked if you did a similar survey and asked Black people in Ireland, they want to see that, I think you'll find that the majority of them actually don't want to see that. Although a lot of majority of them would say we want to be able to help, but a lot of them would not want to see the portrayal in that light. It's similar in the press. We've had challenges with the media in how they frame issues around racism, for instance. But also, I think somebody asked the question about white saviorism, and that comes in the way things are portrayed to people. Not necessarily that it is harmful or that it's the person doing it intends for the harm, but actually the result of it becomes harmful. The Irish Times published an article, I think just shortly before the pandemic, where a man who had experienced racial abuse in a taxi, a taxi driver experienced racial abuse in Dublin, and the Irish Times was reporting on court proceedings to that incident, where the man had abused a taxi driver and called him the N-word, and called him also the offensive C word. I'm actually not going to censor myself now. They called him a cunt and a nigger, and the Irish Times published both words. The first one was cunt. They asterized it, but they published and typed the N-word nigger in full. Again, that's not being sensitive to the needs of Black people in Ireland, but they are particularly sensitive to the needs of the general population without considering how offensive it would be for Black people. They felt the need to censor cunt, and they didn't see the need to censor the word nigger. And that for us shows the privileged position of the person who makes the decision, the editor, the journalist, all of the people who were involved in getting the publication out were white and had no experience whatsoever of being a racialized minority. And that needs to be factored in to the work of development aid organizations. You need Black people in your organizations. You need ethnic minorities in your organizations because it would actually go a long way in terms of shaping and building your relationships between the diaspora community, because there are quite a lot of privileged people in the diaspora who'd love to get involved in your work and provide assistance in your development aid. But a lot of them, when they see the efforts that you do, just look at them and they go, stuff that, I'm not getting involved in that, because it doesn't represent any of the things that they stand for. I will pause there because I could ramble on forever.
Thank you very much. No, really important input there, and I'm sure, you know, very much kind of heard around the table, and important to say that. I mean, I think Eamon said we need to move from our traditional narratives. You've just said in a very real way why. I mean, this isn't a sectoral issue, this is a personal issue. And where a campaign might last a few months, the impact of negative campaigns can affect personally people for years, and you know, move into that racism and all the rest. So really appreciate what you said there. And it is just important as well to know that, I mean, Vicky and Ronan and the team were talking the other day, and we know even with this project, we have to do much more to engage and talk to you guys, to bring in that perspective. I think it's a gap, it's an absence, and we've got to make good on that. So look, really, your input has inspired me more to make sure that that happens. Thank you very much, guys. I'm very conscious we're 1:05 and we barely got anywhere in terms of Q&A and things like that. I know this could run on and on, but I am just worried about time. I suppose I do, though, want to give panelists just a few moments if you've got any things to reflect on from this conversation. Even in a few moments, I'm afraid we can't directly answer all the questions, but maybe if I could just ask each panelist, what's the one takeaway you'll take from today in a few seconds. We will then quickly show the word cloud, if that's okay, to you, Ronan, and let's see how everybody is feeling. But in one word, or just a last final moment, maybe I can ask you, Eamon, any final reflection?
Sure, Suzanne. I think you never probably quite know if you're at an inflection point when you're there, but perhaps I think based on Bulani's kind of input and this discussion we're having in the sector, maybe we're there right now, and this is the time to grasp it, to step into it. And I think very much to use this research driven by Dóchas to equip ourselves with the tools to create real and lasting change in how we communicate this issue, because if we don't, then the rug may be pulled from under our legs.
Thanks very much. And to you, Karen.
Yeah, I suppose in the spirit of how much effort has gone into planning this research, I think my view at this point will be listening to the research in a lot more detail, listening to what I've heard today, and really, I think Eamon had said earlier, like not letting this become something virtually dusty on a virtual shelf, like everything is, but really turning insight into action now. And so I think my reflection on today would be purely listening to everything I've heard, and then, you know, taking it back as a team in Trócaire, and then as a wider, as a whole sector, and kind of coming up with really insightful plans as opposed to reacting. I, you know, really give it proper consideration.
Thanks for that, Karen. And Bulani, the final word to you.
I think most of us would be familiar with overseas development aid work and the impact, positive impact that it could have. Remember when I grew up in a village in the border in South Africa, the only school that provided high quality education was actually funded by citizens of Switzerland. It wasn't even funded by the South African government or South African. So the impact of overseas development aid is quite huge, particularly in countries where the state simply is unwilling or unable to make provisions for people who are impoverished. And so the aid becomes the critical point of access to services such as healthcare, primary healthcare, but also education. And I was pleased to see then that both healthcare and education are at the top of the agenda in terms of people's expectations of where the money that is poured into development aid actually should be going.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry, we will have to end it pretty much there. I know we've run out of time. Here's how you're feeling, or how you were feeling a few minutes ago. Hopeful, excited, optimistic. Those are the big words, which is good to hear. I'm not going to even attempt to summarize what we've gone through in this short hour and a half, but I suppose just a few headlines from me. I think on the one hand, this research, you know, it's not entirely surprising. We're not starting from the beginning here. It has reinforced a lot of the things we already know. And it also has to give us confidence that we're doing a lot of good work around communicating. So let's not lose that. Let's build on that. But what the research is doing, as everybody said, it's giving us more detail, a greater depth about what will resonate with audiences. It's also going to help us, as the Minister reminded us at the beginning, we need to stop preaching to the converted and go beyond our comfort zone. So I hope certainly the audience segmentation will help us to do that in a very targeted way. As I say, also, I think we've heard today, there is a lot of positives here. In particular, this idea that Irish people really see our work as a moral duty. And that's something we can really kind of build on. And that's very rooted and hope very deep. But at the same time, I think, as we've all said, we can't afford complacency. We can't afford a complacency, particularly around that area of trust. But also I picked up on that sense that sometimes on some of these issues, you know, well, I do, people feel overwhelmed, don't they? So we've got to be careful about our messaging, not to send, I always say we've got to send people to the edge of the cliff, but not allow them to fall off it. So we've got to give a sense of purpose and that our work does make a difference. We also heard here that the newness of channels around kind of social media, but increasingly there's a very negative impact to that. And that, you know, the growing hate crime and all the rest spread through social media. We really need to look at that and engage with that more. But lastly, I think, and one thing that I think we really heard from our final speaker, we can't be complacent around our place of privilege. And this idea that we are in our little bubble and we are in a very privileged bubble, and we need to break out of that and be very conscious of that. And I think even wider than this conversation around public engagement, we're seeing it in our own strategy process, this issue around diversity, inclusion, and really feeling that connectedness back in Ireland. So a lot there. I will just say, in terms of the project itself, this isn't the end, this is only the beginning. And I think one comment or a number of comments made in the chat was this idea of, well, collaboration, what is that actually going to look like? And I do want to remind people, that was actually the heart of this project. That is the heart of this project. We started now with this survey. Now I hope with the steering group, we can really build on that collaboration and say, well, what does that actually mean in practice? Can we go quickly to this idea of a collective narrative, or maybe a bit more piecemeal, but we do want more collaborations. We've got to tease out what that looks like. I did already say to you that there's going to be a public engagement practitioner workshop so that we can really go deeper and have more of a conversation that we've been able to today around the survey results. We think that will be around June, July, so look out for that. Vicky will share more details around that. And as you know, the Worldview Toolkit, the presentation and all the details are already on our website, so make sure to look at that. So I'm going to leave you there. I'm going to thank all our panelists, to Eamon, to Karen, to Bulalani, to Ian. Great to see you there. And with all that research, thank you for your insights, and also to Keelan, and of course to Minister Brophy and to many colleagues at Irish Aid for listening in and supporting this process. Now I need something from you. We are posting the evaluation into the chat right now. If you don't have to rush for your lunch, please fill it in now, fill it in a bit later. Let us know how you feel so that we can do this more and better into the future. And last but not least, as you all, many of you know me, I tend to abuse my position as the MC, which I will do now, to say two things. Dóchas right now is doing a members survey. We need to hear from you about what you need us to do. We know public engagement is really important, so tell us about it, but what else? We're doing a member survey now. We need the results in by Friday. So please, if you can, everybody fill that in. And last but not least, put 12th and 13th of May into your diaries. As you know, we're in a strategy process. On Monday, we have this fantastic series of workshops to reimagine our sector. And so much of what was said today resonates. We now need to bring that together into a good vision. We will hopefully share all at our conference on the 13th of May and the AGM on the 12th of May. Please be there, register, and look forward to seeing you then. I'm going to leave it there. I know there's now silence in a horrible virtual world, but hopefully one day soon we will see each other. And again, thank you to all our panelists, to my team, and to all of you on the call. Have a good day. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a million. Bye.